We continue today in our discussion of the last Passover that Jesus would observe with his disciples prior to his death. The Passover ceremony, as we have seen, is rich in symbolism and pictures many things that are important for our understanding of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. Jesus used two of the elements of the Passover observance to establish one of the two ordinances of the church, which we call the Lord's Supper. Today we will study Jesus' last teaching of his disciples. Please join us now as we once again dig deeper into the customs and context of this important passage of Scripture and seek understanding of how this Jewish feast pictures God's redemptive plan for mankind. Last time, our study ended with the Lord instituting the cup of redemption, the third cup, as the cup we are to partake of in our observance of the Lord's Supper. To help put things in order, let's review the parts of the Passover observance. It begins with the Kaddish, which is the ritual that begins with the Kaddish blessing, which sanctifies the feast day. It involves the lighting of the candles and the pouring of the first cup of wine. Then it's followed by the Yurkats, and I'm probably saying these names incorrectly, but I will spell them out for you on the to my right. But the Yurkats follows the Kaddish, and it is before the eating of the vegetable from the cedar plate. Guests perform a ritual hand washing. This is followed by the Karpas, in which the participants dip a vegetable, representing the hopefulness of spring, usually parsley, from the cedar plate into salt water. This represents the tears of slavery, and they eat it. Now, this is the dish that Judas dipped his green vegetable into at the same time as Jesus. The fourth element is the yakats. Here's where the middle portion of the matzah that is put in the matzah tash is snapped in two. And the larger piece, which is now called the afikomen, is put in a linen cloth and that is hidden to be found later by the children. And this represents the body of Christ in our Lord's Supper observance. Fifth is the Magid. As the second cup of wine is poured, the Exodus story is told. And during this time, the youngest guest also asks four established questions that are predicated on this one. And the question is, how is this night different from all other nights? Now, after this questioning is followed by the rakats, in which guests once again wash their hands a second time before the meal begins. This time, a blessing is included also. Now, this is followed by the matzi, and here's where the group shares a blessing specific to the eating of the unleavened bread. The eighth element is the matzo. Here, guests recite a prayer blessing the matzah. This is followed by the morar, which is bitter herbs from the cedar plate, often horseradish, which represents the bitterness of slavery, are tasted by each guest. After that follows the koresh, and as commanded in Numbers 9:11, participants eat bitter herbs, sandwiched between matzah, and then bitter herbs and cheroset between the matzah. Now, this is where Jesus gave Judas the sop, or the matzah sandwich, that we talked about last time, and then told him to do what he must. And we have the sad account of Judas being, once again, filled with Satan and leaving to go and betray him. Now, this was followed by the Shulchan Aruch. This is the main part of the meal, which often includes eating of gefilte fish and matzo ball soup, but can also incorporate a variety of meat or vegetarian entrees and different sides. Following the meal is the zafun. Now, at the end of the meal, the children search for the afikomen, which was hidden earlier, which symbolizes to the Jew a move from brokenness toward healing. But for you and I as believers in the Messiah, Jesus, it represents his body broken for us. Now, after this, the leader recites a series of blessings called the Baresh after the meal. And the third cup of wine is then poured. Now, it is this cup that Jesus describes as his blood shed for many for the remission of sin. Then an extra cup of wine is also poured for the prophet Elijah. And at that time, a child would go open the door of the house to symbolically invite Elijah into the home. Now, the meal is coming to a close and is followed by what is called the Hallel. And the Hallel are psalms of praise that are sung and recited as guests drink their fourth cup of wine. Now, the Hallel are Psalms 113 to 118. Now, after the singing of the Hallel follows the Nirtzah, which is at the end of the ritual. Guests say in Hebrew a phrase which means next year in Jerusalem, which was the hope of every Jewish man and woman and child of that day and of Orthodox Jews and observing Jews even today. Now our text takes us to a dispute among the disciples. Now this took place after the drinking of the third cup, which was after the finding of the afikomen. The disciples still don't understand what is about to happen. Their thoughts are that when the days of the feast are over, Jesus will set up his messianic kingdom. And with the third cup, he has just told them that he will not drink of this fruit of the vine until he drinks it new with them in the kingdom. So notice now how they respond. In Luke chapter 22, beginning with verse 24, we find these words. Now there was a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater? Well, he who sits at the table, or he who serves. Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as the one who serves. But you are those who have continued with me in my trials, and I'll bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one upon me, one that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So, what do the disciples do now? Well, as is common for the disciples, they start arguing. And what are they arguing about? Well, they start arguing about who among them is the greatest. Now remember, this isn't the first time this has happened. Now, Jesus takes this final opportunity to teach them 3 lessons about greatness. The first lesson establishes the principle of greatness. Now, in verses 25 through 26, Jesus establishes something very important. Let's reread that passage. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. Now, Jesus draws a contrast between the Gentile world, which is the unbelieving world, and the disciples in the kingdom. The kings of this world show their greatness by exercising their authority and their power over their subjects. But the leaders in his body, in his kingdom, show greatness not by lording it over people, but by having a servant's heart. That's the principle of greatness. Every great leader has a servant's heart. The next is this example of greatness. In verse 27, he provides them with a specific example of greatness. Now, as we read earlier, he himself took on the role of a servant at the very table where they are now reclining, as he washed their feet. Though he's the Messiah, he's among them as one who serves. Therefore, he is their example of what greatness involves. In other words, the great man never hesitates to serve those that he leads. The third principle he establishes is a promise, and it's his promise to them. In verse 29 through 30, he promises them two things which are as certain as the fact that God the Father has granted him a kingdom. And what are they? Well, first of all, that they will eat and drink at his table in his kingdom. And concerning their future role, he repeats a promise he made earlier. They will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel in the Messianic kingdom. Now, this teaching happened between the third and fourth cups. Now, during the Passover service, there is usually much discussion. In other words, it's not rushed. This is a time of observance, but it's also a time of fellowship. It's a time of teaching. It's a time of discussion. And this discussion typically happens between the third and fourth cups. And it's at this time that Jesus begins a very lengthy teaching session. In John 13:31 through 32, Jesus begins his final instructions to the apostles. Verse 31 says, "So when he, Judas, had gone out, Jesus said, 'Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and glorify him immediately.'" Now, Jesus begins this teaching by saying, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him." Why does he begin with the word now? Well, because the departure of Judas has guaranteed his betrayal. And his betrayal, in turn, assures his coming death. And by means of his death, the Son will glorify the Father. But the Son will also be glorified by the Father. And when will this happen? Immediately. You see, the time has come for Jesus to accomplish his mission and his purpose. Now look at verse 33 of John 13. "Little children, I shall be with you a little while longer. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, where I am going you cannot come. So now I say to you." Now, 2 days earlier, Jesus announced his coming betrayal to the disciples, and he dated it for them. In fact, he said in Matthew 26:2, if you'll recall, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man is to be handed over for crucifixion." But you see, they still don't understand. The 2 days have passed, and again he tells them very plainly of his coming departure, his coming crucifixion. In a few hours, he's going to leave them. And it would be impossible for them to come with him. Now, how do you think they responded to this? You see, they have been with him for 3 years now, all the while believing that he is the Messiah. And during those years, as they waited for him to establish his kingdom, they had learned to trust him completely for every need. He'd been like a father to them, providing, protecting, guiding, even teaching them as the children he loved. He loved them with his divine love, and they enjoyed a very close relationship with him. Now, in a few hours, he's going to leave them. And it was hard for them to understand, and I'm sure it overwhelmed them. and caused them great grief. Now read what Jesus tells them in the next verses 34 and 35. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this will all know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. Now, he leaves a new commandment with them. They are to love one another, even as he loved them. He will no longer be with them, but his love, which they have been enjoying, is to continue as they follow his example and love one another. Now, why does he call this a new commandment? You see, the command to love isn't new. In the law of Moses, they are commanded to love God, and they are commanded to love their neighbor. So, in what sense is this command new? Well, you see, Jesus here changes the standard. Now the standard is not one's love for oneself, but his love for us. And that is a much higher standard than the Mosaic law. Both the very nature of the disciples' love for each other and the expression of it are to be as he loved them. You see, this would be their badge, their sign by which all men will know that they and us are his disciples. Now, next he tells them more of what's about to take place. In Matthew 26, verse 31, then Jesus said to them, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. Now, here Jesus is quoting from the prophet Zechariah, chapter 13 and verse 7. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man my associate, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, that the sheep may be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones. Now he tells them that he's about to depart, to be struck down. And on this very night, they are all going to be scattered away from him. And then he gives them a very important instruction, one, by the way, which they miss. In verse 32 of Matthew 26, Jesus said, but after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. So what's he telling them to do here? Well, basically, he's telling them, don't stay in the city. Once I'm arrested, leave the city, head up to Galilee. It's a 3-day journey. And 3 days later, he will rise again and he will meet them there. But again, they don't understand what he's trying to tell them. The events that follow take them by surprise, and they don't leave for Galilee until much later. Now, Jesus' announcement of his departure raised several questions in the minds of the disciples. And 4 of their specific questions are recorded in the discourse that follows. And the first is asked by Peter. In John 13, beginning with verse 36, Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered him, where I am going, you cannot follow me now. Underline that, now. But you shall follow me afterward. Underline that. Peter said to him, Lord, why cannot I follow you now? I will lay down my life for your sake. You see, Peter's question concerns Jesus' destination. Jesus had left Jerusalem and Judea on previous occasions. He stayed outside the land of Israel to avoid opposition and arrest. On each of these occasions, the disciples had gone with him. And Peter could not understand where he might go that Peter could not go with him. Now, Peter's life will end with him following Jesus in crucifixion. Jesus reiterates that it is impossible for him to follow him at that time. And then he adds, but you will follow later. Now, the you here is singular, meaning Peter specifically. He's addressing Peter at this point. And what's he telling Peter? Where is Jesus going? Well, he's going to crucifixion. He tells Peter that someday he will follow Jesus in the same manner. Now, if church records are correct, and history records this as such, Peter was also crucified. Now, his crucifixion was a little bit different. He was crucified on an X-type cross, upside down. But Peter doesn't understand any of this at this time, and he wants to know why he can't follow Jesus right now. Now, Jesus doesn't answer his question. Instead, he shows Peter the path that lies ahead for him. Now we turn to Luke chapter 22, verse 31, and the Lord said, Simon, Simon, remember that's Peter's Hebrew name. Indeed, Satan has asked for you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith should not fail. And when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. Now, what's he telling Peter here? Well, first, that what is about to take place is the result of a tremendous spiritual conflict over Peter, a conflict between the Messiah and Satan. Now, this is somewhat reminiscent of the conflict between Satan and God over, you'll remember the story of Job. Now, as a result of this conflict, Peter will follow the wrong path for a time. But his faith will not fail, and he will turn again to the right path. Now, folks, I think we can take great encouragement from this. Many times we follow the wrong path for a time. But if our faith is true, in him and not in ourselves, we will turn again to the right path. A dear friend of mine, Cliff Palmer, used to say it this way: a faith that fizzles before the finish was faulty from the first. Peter's faith was genuine, and it did not fizzle. Now, the second thing that Jesus tells Peter is that once he's turned back to the right path, he's to strengthen the other apostles. Now, the Greek word here is very, very interesting and very important. The Greek word is sterizo, meaning to fix or to make fast, to set. Often it's used often translated to establish. Now, Peter himself will use this same word when he writes 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 12, where he says, therefore I will always be ready to remind you of these things, even though you already know them, and have been established in what? In the truth which is present with you. You see, Peter would establish them in the truth. Now, friends, it's the truth that establishes us. In this day where people cannot tell a truth from a lie, we need more than ever to be established in the truth, and the truth is God and his word. Now, this is how Peter was to strengthen them, strengthen the apostles, strengthen his peers, strengthen those who would follow, by establishing them in the truth. And as we shall see, Peter will be the first member of the apostolic group to see the resurrected Messiah. And at that time, Jesus will remind him of his role in feeding his sheep. Now, we'll have to pick up there next time, unless the rapture comes first. Shalom.